Moriden Athluan.
The story of his near single-handed assault on Windhelm and his execution of the traitor Ulfric Stormcloak of Windhelm are staples of the Imperial Legion. His devotion to duty, his zeal in combat, his dedication to the safety of the Empire and its citizens are told to all new recruits of the Legion.
Though his actions in the Civil War were what drew the eyes of all Tamriel to him, it is not what he is best known for. No, for it was after his days in the Legion that he began to show his true dedication to both the gods and the people of the Empire.
Come now and hear the tale of the Moriden Athluan's glorious mercenary days, and the great good that he did for all the people of Skyrim.
The bards can
warred with
always
the
be
gods'
trusted
names.
to take a story and turn it to their own ends. There are elements of truth to their story. The truth, though, the truth is not what the bards would have you believe. Prologue. The war was over, yes. Through my actions, driven by obsession, I had led the charge into Windhelm and fought my way to the Palace of the Kings, where I was to put a slow and painful end to Ulfric Stormcloak. The power of my own obsession, my own purpose, pushed me from the beggar on his streets to the killer on his doorstep. I didn't do it for the rest of the province. Despite my own words and beliefs at the time, I didn't do it for the other Dunmeri of Windhelm either. I did it for me, and me alone. When he was dead at my feet, his life poured out onto the flagstones of the Palace of the Kings, I had expected to feel release, rapture, a sublime joy. I found none of that. Instead, I spent the rest of that fateful day in the wilds of northern Eastmarch, and the day following. And the day following. All I felt was alone and cold. Eventually, it was a promise to a Khajiit that drove me back to Windhelm. Keeping that promise was suddenly important to me. It gave me a purpose, and with Ulfric dead, that was something I desperately needed to have. This need would drive my increasing descent into darkness. A darkness from which I would never emerge. 27 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. It was a need for company, any kind of company, that finally drove me back to Windhelm. With a few days between the end of the war and now, I'd had time to think. With Ulfric dead, I needed to find something new to do with my life. Oh, sure, there was still the Legion. No doubt they were going to find something for me, some kind of victory tour. Come, see the Mer who killed the rebel Jarl. No, thank you. Fame was never my goal. But, with my goal met, I needed another. One possibility presented itself as I walked through the gates, back into my childhood home. An Orzamer, and a very grizzled one, from the look I got of him, stopped me and looked me over. I don't think he knew who I was, which was welcome at this point, but he did like what he saw. Then again, I also get the impression that I might have met that requirement if I was blind in both eyes and deaf in both ears, so long as I was willing to fight vampires. Ah, yes, that was what he was recruiting for, something called the Dawn Guard. There had been a rise in vampire attacks of late. I'd even seen a few on the roads when I'd been traveling this last month, but thought nothing of it. Before I could consider that, though, I had two things to deal with. The first required me to return to the Palace of the Kings. Except, as it turned out, Freewinter wasn't at the palace, though it had been cleaned up, and it was hard for me not to look for bloodstains before the throne of the hold. Freewinter didn't spend a lot of time in the palace. The Jarl was a man of the people, I was told. That didn't surprise me. He'd always had that reputation. So naturally, he was among his people, earning their trust and loyalty. In this city, that was going to be a long, uphill battle. I found him in the market quarter, assisting one of the stall keepers with her stock. When he saw me, his face lit up, or rather, when he saw the hero of Skyrim, his eyes lit up. He at least knew who I was. In his favor, though, he brightened even further when I reported that the bandits we'd spoken of were dead and gone. But he's also given me something new to look at. Since the fall of Windhelm, there's been someone slinking around the city at night. So far, 4 murders. He's pretty sure it isn't the Dark Brotherhood, given the state of the young ladies found so far. Never mind that the Brotherhood wouldn't kill unless it was 4 separate contracts. Given how rare it is for that to happen in a single city that close together, he's pretty sure we're dealing with a regular murderer. Freewinter asked that I check in with the local city gossip Viola Giardino. If anyone knows anything about this killer, it would be her, and it would be a load off of his mind. For Freewinter, I will do this, though investigations are not something I've really ever tried my hand at. Viola had some information, just not a lot of it. Mostly, she just fears for her own safety and is trying to get the word out about this so-called butcher. That doesn't leave me a lot to go off of, but she did mention 2 of the victims. One is one of the Shatter Shield sisters. That family is almost as important in Windhelm as the Greymanes or Battleborns think they are in Whiterun. So if there is information to be gotten, then perhaps Tova, the family matron, might be best to talk to. The other was no one of significance, though she was an assistant to an Imperial writer, name of Liatelli. I know he spends most of his time at the Candlehearth Inn, and I have to admit that the idea of going in there just to irritate Elder Earlydawn, that racist innkeeper there, perks me up a bit. So perhaps that might be the better path first. Liatelli didn't have much to say on the subject, only that they found her on the docks, and that what had been done to her was barbaric. Of the other 3 victims, he knew only about the Shatter Shield girl. Since I saw the patron of the family in the inn as well, I tried speaking with him, but he was already 3 drinks into his own grieving process and was barely understandable, which means I may well have to speak to Tova after all. At least she isn't known as a Dunmer hater. That would have made this even more difficult. Tova was downstairs, and it looked like she was trying her husband's coping method. She, however, wasn't far into her attempt, and we were able to speak somewhat. Understandably, she didn't want to talk about the entire affair. But when I told her I was trying to get to the bottom of the matter, to deal with it, since the Jarl and the God simply couldn't, given the current upheaval in the city, she agreed to at least talk. Her daughter was killed on the doorsteps of her home, a place up in the noble quarter called Hearthfire, one of the few places that hadn't been burned at some level during the Battle of Windhelm, actually, at least not that I noticed at the time. In fact, with that building being empty now and relatively undamaged, it occurred to me that it might possibly be a good place for this murderer to hide, who would think to look in the home of his victim. Tova wasn't sure of that, but she was willing to let me have a look. She handed me the key to her home, asked me to keep her informed, and then politely turned her back on me and put all her concentration on her tankard. Can't say as I blame her. My initial impressions as I walked the empty interior of Hearthfire was that Tova was right. I had wasted my time. But then something caught my eye. A chest in the main room, and from the dust on the floor, I could tell it was something that had been moved recently. My curiosity sparked, I opened it, and found a journal. The writer never names themselves, but the meaning of the writing was clear enough. This is not just random killing. There is a dark purpose behind it. From the wording, this killer is a necromancer. Susanna the Wicked, one of the tavern girls, was to be their next target, but she's been proving elusive. I'll have to pass word on to her and Elder, I suppose, so she can keep herself safe. Now that I can prove to some degree what's going on, she should take it seriously. Then there was the back room, where a desk held several copies of a warning flyer written by Viola. Those, however, weren't of interest. The amulet I found underneath it was. The disc was worn, but appeared to be a skull of some kind, not something you would find normally, so I have to imagine there is significance to it. If anyone has information like this in Windhelm, it would be Calixto, an Imperial curiosities trader. Finally, though, I found a false back on a wardrobe, and what I found behind it confirmed all I had begun to guess about necromancy being the purpose behind these killings. I'll check with Calixto before I go any further. I can prove it is necromancy, but I cannot prove who is doing it. The journal did mention time at Winterhold, perhaps a mage of some kind. Perhaps the amulet's identity will lead to the killers. Calixto had already closed up for the night, so I shelved that for tomorrow. Instead, I went to Candlehearth Hall and spoke with both Susanna and Elda. Though Elda was clearly not happy to be speaking to me at all, her anti-Dunmer sentiments showing through, neither could deny the writing in the journal I had found. Susanna will be staying at the inn for a few days at least, hopefully enough time for this matter to be dealt with. The fear in the girl's eyes made it clear she had thought something was off, and though the fear is still there, at least she knows what she was dealing with. Those discussions complete, I rented a room, another dark sigh from Elda when I requested it, and slept in warmth for the first time in days. 28 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. My discussion with Calixto was informative. He has identified the amulet as the Wheelstone, a traditional symbol of Windhelm's power and usually carried by the court mage. He also quoted me a buy price of 500 septums. I offered just to give it back to the current court mage, and Calixto indicated first that Woundfirth, the current court mage, would have no interest in it, and, perhaps more interestingly, that there are rumors that the man dabbles in necromancy. All very interesting. And about half of it is pure imagination. Lies. The price he offered for the amulet was too low by far. I could tell that by how he spoke his offer. His reaction about Woundfirth might be partially true. I have heard some of those same rumors for years, but had always discounted them. But it was far more explosive than it should have been. And to just drop that little bit about necromancy, that was a fear tactic designed to make me stay away from the wizard. This amulet is not what he's claiming it is. But why lie to me? Unless he has some kind of interest in it beyond its supposed historical value. I wasn't planning to talk to the mage at first. It was just a tactic to get information. Now I wonder if it might be worth it. I very much doubt the necromancy charges, after all. The premier mage of the city practicing such an art when he can't go anywhere without drawing attention? No. But he might have some new ideas to follow up on. I stepped out into the snowy morning and straight into the central gossip distribution system, Viola. If I didn't know better, I'd say she was following me. We spoke only briefly, mostly because she didn't want the small talk, just the bottom line. So yes, she's been following me. I showed her the journal, leaving out the amulet and the information about it. As soon as necromancy was mentioned, she gave me the same name that Calixto had, Woundfirth. She gave me the strictest orders to go straight to the new steward, Captain Lonely Gale, and give the information straight to him, and then left, certain that she had solved the entire situation. Gossips. Though his name has come up twice, I still find it hard to believe that Woundfirth would be that brazen. I decided to talk to him directly, and his introduction of himself did not help his case. Anything you've heard I can do is probably true. Oops. There wasn't a graceful way to introduce the topic, so I confronted him with the rumors. The anger he had when I asked was too genuine. He doesn't dabble in necromancy. His proud statement of having been a member of the College of Winterhold in good standing spoke too much to his nature. He might like his power, but he has his limits. Necromancy is clearly one of them. Once he settled down, though, several things came to light. First, the amulet. Calixto may be forgiven for thinking as he did, but this amulet is no symbol of Windhelm power. It is instead a symbol of a darker power, the Necromancer's Amulet, a legendary artifact. Between this and the journals, Woundfirth did some kind of mystical calculations, the likes of which I cannot hope to understand, but claimed he found a pattern. This killer, this fledgling necromancer, will strike soon. Most likely tomorrow night, Woundfirth claims. He seems confident, but I would hate to find that some young woman had died because he miscalculated by a day. So I will be on the streets tonight, looking for someone who doesn't belong, other than myself, of course. Hopefully, someone else hasn't figured this all out as well and fingers me as the killer. Between the weather and the hour, there was little purpose in being out of doors. Instead, I returned to the candle hearth, where I caught Makara just as she arrived from Whiterun. Though she claims she's being treated well, she is in one piece after all, the locals are still treating her with all the distrust she mentioned the first time around. Add to that the whole butcher situation, and she decided that staying inside at the hall was likely the safest thing she could do. I happened to agree. I filled her in on what I knew, what I was planning, and then apologized for not being ready to see Kagranzel just yet. She understood, of course. And after her long cold walk here, she wasn't quite ready to go yet either, fear for her brother's life or no. She agreed to wait until I had resolved the butcher situation, and may have slyly hinted that I might bash in a few faces to resolve the racism situation as well. I don't think it would change anything, but it might be worth a shot. I have both succeeded and failed. The identity of the murderer has been revealed. Calixto. The why of it still remains to be determined, but the identity is all but certain. As I patrolled the stone quarter, I heard a scream from the market. Rushing to the stalls, I found Calixto rushing away from it, blood on his hands. That was all I needed. I drew and placed an arrow in his chest, sending him to the ground to gasp out his last breath. He had nothing else of interest in his pockets, nothing to make me think necromancer, but the blood on his clothes, not to mention on his dagger, was too thick to have been from a casual brushing. Which leads to how I have failed. It was not Susanna he had targeted, but another young woman who used to work, in the stables. Aravanya was struck from behind, likely in the middle of turning when she had been attacked. She had lived long enough to scream, drawing attention to the murder before she died. The Legion is already on the scene and dealing with the corpses. I've given what I know to the lead investigator and promised I would report what I knew to the steward in the morning. But first, I have the key to Calixto's shop, and I believe the reasons behind the killings are to be found there. The answer to Calixto's murderings turned out to be love, of all things. A twisted kind of love, but love nonetheless. He had mentioned in passing that he had traveled the world with his sister. He did not mention that she was dead. He had been killing these young women to get the ingredients and parts he needed to create a new body for her. A short and tragic answer to a short and tragic affair. I will present all the journals and the rest to the steward in the morning, and then I'll get with Makara to begin the search for her brother. I saw one of my least favorite citizens of Windhelm as I approached the candle hearth. Rolf is one of the two drunks I saw accosting one of the other Dunmeri the day I left the city. Despite the fact that the city has fallen to the Empire, that Ulfric is dead and his cause with him, Rolf was still trash-talking the Dunmer. So, I decided to try Makara's suggestion, and I beat him within an inch of his life. I was right. It didn't change his attitude. Sure felt good, though. 29 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. The former captain, now steward, Lonelygale, listened to my story the next morning, at first with incredulity. Calixto was a bit odd, but given all his travels, most figured it had to do with that. As I laid out the evidence, in the order I'd found it, including the events in the stone quarter last night, his expression changed from disbelief to thoughtful to grim. Calixto, I think, is lucky he died cleanly, rather than become a guest of the revamped Windhelm Guard. He promised to pass on the story to the Jarl when he held court next, a time that could be a week off for all Lonelygale knew, and also promised to pass the story to the Guard as well. Which means I am free to join with Makara and begin our search of Kagranzel. I met with Makara at the Windhelm gates, and we set forth into the wilds of Eastmarch. We had little to go on. A name and a general location somewhere in the Velothi Mountains, southeast of Windhelm. She still caught her breath in occasional pain as we walked, her injuries still plaguing her, but bearing up well otherwise. She isn't looking forward to this search, but more because she is afraid of what she will find than her own personal discomfort. For me, I was glad to get back out of the city. People like Rolf aside, I had expected more genial treatment from the people of the city, especially from the other Dunmer. So far, that has not been in evidence. I almost got the impression that they'd have as soon I hadn't killed Ulfric. But that couldn't possibly be the case, could it? There was little time for wondering on such matters, as another thing I'd been trying to forget forced itself into my life again. Another dragon, and clearly unlike any other I've yet seen. Perhaps I should start naming the things just for clarity. So, at least in my own writings, I will call this one a crystal dragon, for that was what it seemed to be made from. Shining crystals that took the light of the world and bent it to cause destruction. I was close enough to Windhelm still that the obvious solution was to retreat back to the walls and get the help of the Legion to fight the thing. And so that was exactly what I did. With the archers on the walls, my own efforts, and enough time, we eventually grounded the beast. More time, and we finally killed the thing, which left me to do what I have done with every dragon I've ever encountered. The disorientation wasn't as bad as it had been before, so I do believe I'm getting used to this rush. Also, like before, I wasn't able to put a name to the concept or word or whatever it was I pulled from the dead dragon's mind. Now that the war is over, maybe that's something I should look into more. I have ignored the Greybeard's call for weeks at this point, for good reason, but still ignored them. Once this thing with Makara is done, perhaps. Now on the road, with no dragon distractions, the two of us compared notes. She had been all over this region, and had seen no evidence of the city we were looking for, which allowed us to eliminate most, if not all, of the more obvious sections of the mountains to check. I had been in a few areas myself, during the short time I had been here as part of the Imperial War effort, but nothing stood out in my memory either. By the time we had passed Kynesgrove, we had eliminated pretty much the entire region of the mountains that were low-lying, which meant, if there was a city to be found, it would have to be high up in the mountains. There was one set of trails I had not traveled, not far from where the Imperial camp had been set up, and telling Makara about it revealed she'd not seen that trail, which gave us a place to start looking. There was little to find at first. The trails we were following were clearly well-traveled, which made them leading to a Dwemer city none had ever heard of to be unlikely. However, at last, we found a trail that was decidedly less so, and, more importantly, led upwards into the peaks instead of skirting along in the hills. Though we had to briefly deal with a pair of Daedra worshippers, a pest where a necromancer is a plague, the trail continued to be all but deserted. We crossed into the snows, and still it continued upward. We were not concerned except for the sun beginning to drop below the horizon, and so were almost ready to set up camp when a stairway and arches of Dwemer make suddenly revealed themselves to our eyes. Maybe there was more to this after all. We pushed forward, intending to go only slightly further before making camp, unless the city itself was suddenly sprawled before us. We turned a corner, and the city was suddenly spread out before us. Or at least a Dwemer city was. We poked around its edge, eventually locating the entrance, and beside it, a nameplate. Kagrenzel. We'd found it. But not without cost. Makar's ribs were paining her terribly, every breath turning into a shudder. She clearly did not want to admit it to herself, let alone me, but this was as far as she would be able to go. I knew who we were looking for, and though I'd never been in a Dwemer ruin before, I had heard stories, surely enough to keep me safe from a bunch of vanished trap makers. I made a fire near the entrance, along with a tent. I left her all the wood I could to keep it going, along with some of the food I had brought along. She would wait here, while I would go in alone. I've always worked better that way anyhow, something the General and the Legate had always recognized. Tomorrow morning, I would enter the ruin to see what could be found.